Okay. Turn to number 157. Sing the first and fourth, and then we'll ask Dennis to lead us in opening prayer. 157, He leadeth me. He leadeth me, O blessed thought, O words with heavenly comfort fraught. Whate'er I do, where'er I be, still 'tis God's hand that leadeth me. He leadeth me, by His own hand He leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, for by His hand He leadeth me. And when my task on earth is done, when by Thy grace the victory's won, in death's cold wave I will not flee, since God through Jordan leadeth me. He leadeth me, by His own hand He leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, for by His hand He leadeth me. After traveling to Decapolis and spending 3 full days there, healing, teaching, and even feeding the multitudes, Jesus sends them away, climbs into a boat with His apostles, and they sail to the west side of the Sea of Galilee, to Magdala. Jesus understood the urgency in spreading the gospel and the good news to the Jews first, and to the Greeks, the Gentiles, when they presented themselves. But He also realized that His frail human body required rest, required nourishment. There were times where He could be found in the aft end of the boat sleeping as the disciples sailed across the sea, gave Him an opportunity to get His rest, knowing that when He arrived on the next shore that the people would be waiting for Him. And now even the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes are waiting for Him, as we see here in chapter 16 of Matthew. More and more these hypocrites will hound Jesus as they desperately try to find some tidbit of contradiction in His teachings that they can use against Him. Lately, it appears most of Jesus' teachings and healings was accomplished not too far from the shore. He seems like He's going back and forth across the sea. And usually there's a boat nearby ready to launch to go back to the other side after He's finished. Figured it's the only way he can get rid of the multitude, because if he stays and walks somewhere else, they follow him, and he can't get any peace. How wonderful it would be for men and women today to love the truth, that they would flock to a teacher like they did with Jesus, to hear something they'd never heard before, to consider whether it comes from God or if it's from men. But instead, we find the majority of people disinterested in religious things today in this country and around the world. So Matthew continues in chapter 16 with Jesus and his apostles reaching the western shore of the Sea of Galilee and encountering the blind guides once again. Verse 1. Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came, testing him, asked that he should show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, when it is evening, you say it is fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites! You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. Now when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Then Jesus said to them, take heed and beware of the bread of the Pharisees and Sadducees, the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, it's because we have taken no bread. But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, O ye of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000, how many baskets you took up? Nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000, and how many baskets you took up? How is it you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. The same question had been asked of Jesus before, back in chapter 12, verse 38 to 40, about giving a sign. And we understand their cleverness, and Jesus certainly did, in asking a question in front of the multitudes. They put forth an air of respect in the way they're asking Jesus, an unassuming face before the people, when inwardly their purpose is to try to trap him. They're not honest at all about what they're asking. After all, the people knew the law required that any supposed prophet had to prove his divine appointment, as we see in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 15 to 22, and chapter 13, verse 1 through 15. Jesus, the giver of the law, knew it as well, which is most likely why Paul described the Jews before the Corinthians as the Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 22. The fact that they were asking for a sign from heaven didn't mean some miracle that came down from the sky, but a sign that came from God himself. Something that required no faith whatsoever. Just something so blatant no one could question it. Something maybe like stopping the sun in the middle of the sky for a whole day, as we see in Joshua chapter 10, verse 13 and 14. Or, as Gideon asked God to prove to him that God would be behind Gideon, that there would be dew. He would wake up in the morning, there'd be dew everywhere, but the fleece on the ground would be dry. Judges chapter 6, verse 37 to 40. Now there's one difference here from that of Matthew chapter 12. Chapter 12, we find the scribes and the Pharisees asking for a sign. Now we find the Sadducees joining forces with the Pharisees, something that very seldom occurred. They hated one another. They were common enemies.
Was the other difference? I'm thinking 12 added the sign of Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, and so the Son of Man spent 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. But this one doesn't
No,
indicate that one. That just
no. Well, he's so fed up with them. He said, you know, the sign of Jonah, like I told you before, and I'm not going to explain it to you again, you know, because you don't really care. Yeah, chapter 12, he explains the sign of Jonah. Yeah. So Jesus had opposed the traditionalism of the Pharisees and pointed out that even the Sadducees agreed with him, while the Sadducees were attacked by Jesus because of their teachings against angels, against the resurrection, and other views held by the Pharisees. Then there's a political arena where the common people had turned away from them and to follow Jesus. So for now, Jesus has become the common enemy for them to fight against together as they struggle for keeping their power. You know, if they can get rid of him, then they can go back to fighting each other for power. Kind of like the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So for now, they are worried about keeping the law, keeping their traditions, hoping the law will provide them a way to get rid of Jesus. You know, otherwise, they don't care about the law. They only care about their tradition. Kind of like some other people today that I know. Only when law fits them do they care about the law or the Constitution. So Matthew says that they came to test, to try Jesus. And I think testing is the better word there than try, which is really the meaning of the Greek word here. Putting Jesus to the test for the sole purpose of discrediting him publicly. You know, if it were not for the Romans, they would have killed him on the spot and been done with him. But they can't do that. So they have to be sly about it in their approach. All they needed was for him to commit some felony, according to the law, that would call for the death penalty, and they could turn him over to Pilate for Pilate to put him to death. Now, in the eyes of the Sadducees, who did not believe in the supernatural, you know, they're happy for Jesus. Yeah, go ahead and give us a sign. We don't believe in him anyway. We don't believe you can do it, but yeah, go ahead. Give it a try. You know, let's show the people how you're going to fail. But the Pharisees, it was their belief God would never allow such a man as Jesus to authenticate himself with any sign, because he's guilty of contradicting their traditions. So God's got to be against him. even though both the Pharisees and Sadducees have their own agenda, it appears by their question they may be expecting something supernatural. Verse 2 and 3, Jesus answers them. When it's evening, you say it's fair weather, for the sky is red. In the morning, it's going to be foul weather today because the sky is red and threatening. You're hypocrites. You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. This is one of those times that the Bible critics think they found a problem in the Scriptures here. They contend Matthew did not write this, but that some scribe added it later, inserted it into Matthew's letter. As some of the old manuscripts do not find these words in the text. So they allude, there's the evidence right there. It wasn't in the oldest manuscripts, yet we find it here. Then there are those who believe that it was added later, but copied from Luke's account. Well, Luke, in Luke chapter 12, verse 54 to 56, doesn't even say the same thing. I mean, it alludes to it, but, I guess you'd have to say it was a paraphrase, but not exactly copied. Luke's account says nothing about the Pharisees and Sadducees asking Jesus a question to begin with, like Matthew does. Now, Jerome admitted in his day, in the 2nd century, most manuscripts did not have verse 2 and 3 to Matthew 16. Yet he included them in his Latin Vulgate, which the Latin Vulgate was used by many when they were writing the first English versions of the Bible, which is most likely how that got into our Bibles. But there's no doubt that we find here what is called a textual variant. There's many variants throughout the Scriptures, but variants don't teach false doctrine. Okay? They're just happen to be left out of one account, found in another account, and so forth. And most likely it's due to copying mistakes. But that shouldn't alarm us, unless, of course, it actually did teach false doctrine because of adding that into it, which isn't found in the originals. Luke did record Jesus saying about the weather, not in exactly the same way as we find it in Matthew, but still, it's there in Luke, and Luke is not questioned by anyone. So what if we find it in Matthew? The fact of the matter is that Jesus refused their request, most likely because he knew their hearts. He had already provided plenty of signs, plenty of proof during his ministry so far that even the common man believed and caused them to follow him. If that's not enough evidence, then he knew that if he did something now, they still wouldn't believe. Now, the New King James chose to render the Greek word oranos as sky rather than heaven, as they did concerning the question by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. When they said they wanted a sign from heaven, same Greek word. Okay? So Jesus provides them an answer, this time by using the word heaven instead of sky, heaven, 3 times. The very heaven you are demanding proof of my authority with the sign is the very heaven that condemns you for making it such a challenge. You predict the weather from heaven, but you don't discern the face of heaven. But then he talks about the signs of the times. The signs of the times meaning the evidence that the Messiah has come is the signs of the times. Jesus then refers to them as an evil and adulterous generation in verse 4. They were evil because they refused to accept the signs given so far as proof that he is the Messiah. They were evil because they cared more about their traditions than they did the Word of God. They were evil because they didn't care about the souls of others due to their leading them by their false traditions. They were an adulterous generation because they were self-righteous will worshipers. No sign would be given to them. For if it was not a sign that they lacked in recognizing Jesus as the Christ, it was their sight. They were blind guides. They refused to see the obvious. And they would have refused to see one if Jesus had gone ahead and given them a sign. Any honest observer of miracles that Jesus was performing over the past year had to admit that God was behind it all. I mean, John chapter 3, verse 2. A Pharisee by the name of Nicodemus came to Jesus at night. We know that you are a teacher come from God. Why? How do you know that? For no man does these signs that you do except God be with him. There we have a Pharisee that recognizes it. His eyes were open. His heart was open. So these Pharisees could have done the same thing. They just chose not to. The Pharisees and Sadducees were so blinded by their power struggle, by their traditions, by their self-righteousness, they wouldn't allow themselves to admit the truth. Jesus was rocking the boat of centuries of tradition, and they're teaching the people the opposite of what Jesus was teaching them now, which really wasn't the opposite, because all along the law had been teaching them if they had opened their eyes. Remember? The law is our what? Schoolmaster, our tutor, to lead us to Christ. Not the traditions of the Pharisees, the law. Now back in chapter 12, verse 38 to 40, Jesus had said the same thing to the scribes and the Pharisees concerning the sign of Jonah, as Austin already pointed out. He explained the meaning, but this time he just simply refers to it. He's not going to take the time. I mean, you can tell he's fed up by once he says that, he leaves. Turns around and leaves. Knowing that they don't care about the truth, their only interest is to trap him so that they can destroy him. Verse 5 says, Jesus and his disciples go to the other side of the sea, and once they get there, disciples realize what? Yeah, they didn't have bread. They didn't restock while they had the chance. They were so wrapped up in what was going on here with the Sadducees and Pharisees, and they thought that they would have had time. They were kind of in shock that Jesus just suddenly jumped back in the boat and was ready to leave. Didn't give them a chance to restock. Mark records it, and he left them entering into the ship again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread. Neither had they in the ship with them more than one loaf. Mark 8:13 and 14. So they had one loaf with them. But that wasn't enough. Now Mark also informs us that Jesus and his disciples had made their way to the north side of the sea. Not directly, they didn't go east. They went to Bethsaida, which would allow them to then travel by foot northward to Caesarea Philippi. Now it wasn't as if they didn't have any bread whatsoever, because Mark says they had one loaf that was in the boat. But one loaf is not enough to feed everybody compared to, what our loaf of bread today is quite a bit different than theirs. Theirs was flat bread, about 8 inches in diameter and 1 inch thick. That was a loaf of bread. Usually would take care of one person. So their focus had been on the clash between Jesus and the Jewish leaders, and they just forgot. Plus Jesus' sudden decision to depart didn't give them time to resupply themselves. But in verse 6, Jesus warns his disciples of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Back in chapter 13, verse 33 and following, Jesus had given a parable about leaven, a universal symbol of what? Corruption. I mean, isn't that basically what leaven does anyway? Kind of, it corrupts, makes it rise. And that corrupting is whether through influence or teachings. In the case of chapter 13, it was the corrupt influences of the Pharisees. Here, it's about their doctrines, as the disciples finally realized. With the Pharisees, it was their traditionalism, their self-righteousness. With the Sadducees, it was their refusal to accept the resurrection and anything supernatural. Mark chapter 8 and verse 15, Jesus warns of the leaven of the Herods. Here we don't have any mention about that, but just the Pharisees and Sadducees. Mark talks about the Herods. Now, if you'll recall, the Pharisees had at one time joined forces with the Herodians, just like they're now joining forces with the Sadducees. Mark chapter 3 and verse 6. The Herodians were of the Hellenistic persuasion. However, despite their religious and political differences, they all had one thing in common. The Pharisees, Sadducees, the Herodians, they hated the kingdom of God. And with this warning of watching out for the leaven of these groups, the disciples reason among themselves, thinking Jesus is talking about physical leaven. He's upset we didn't get bread when we were over on the other side. So perceiving their inability to grasp what he's referring to, he says to them, verse 8, being aware of it, O ye of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Do you not understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000? How many baskets you took up? Nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000, and how many baskets you took up? How is it you do not understand that I do not speak of you concerning bread, but beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? I didn't say anything about bread. I was talking about the leaven. Those are 2 different things. Even though we find leaven in bread, so unlike before when the disciples asked Jesus how they would feed the 4,000, this time Jesus rebukes them for their little faith, which he didn't before. Their lack of spiritual insight caused the disciples to kind of inwardly scold themselves for not repurchasing more bread before they left, but falsely assuming that's what Jesus was referring to. And it may be due to their embarrassment in Jesus' choice to flee the scene of the Pharisees and Sadducees' challenge. Rather than proving to them with the sign, which he could have done, that he was the Messiah. But Jesus didn't depart in shame. He didn't depart with an inability to give them an answer in the way that they wanted it, which would have made the disciples proud. He left because he knew there was no point in proving anything with the sign. Because unlike the disciples, he knew their hearts. If he would have recognized some of them were serious, were honest about it, yeah, he probably would have done so, but he knew that they didn't care. How many baskets, he says? How many baskets did you take up with the 4,000 and the 5,000? Just 1 basket would have been plenty of proof that he was the Messiah. It didn't take 7, it didn't take 12, only 1. Because that shows he fed all those people, and there was even some left over. Then he asked why they did not understand what he was speaking about. That he was talking about the leaven, not the bread. Jesus uses an antithesis here, which became a metaphor. If leaven stands in contrast of the bread, which is, of course, made with leaven, then the leaven must be understood figuratively. Therefore, the metaphor that Jesus used here finds the leaven representing teaching, which the disciples realize in verse 12. And when Jesus said that, talked about how many baskets, and said I didn't say anything about bread, I was talking about leaven, all of a sudden the light bulb comes on. Well, in their day it would have been a candle or something. And they realized they misunderstood. Just because Jesus said the leaven was the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees, did it not also mean influence as well? Because instruction, teaching, doctrine, does it not influence those that are taught? Sure it does. How else do denominations exist if it were not for the influence of the false doctrine that is taught? Which the same can be said about cults or any other religious beliefs. Despite the warnings of God, through His Word, for us to be aware of false teachers. Be aware of wolves in sheep's clothing. Matthew chapter 7, verse 15. We are to be on the watch at all times. 1 Corinthians 16:13. Yet less and less brethren are being watchful, caring more about some prolific speaker rather than making sure that he's not involved in some false teaching or fellowshipping those who are involved in false teaching. More and more leaven is overtaking the brotherhood, which is something 20 years ago we didn't see so much as we're seeing today in the brotherhood. So we have to be aware. We have to be vigilant.
In the brotherhood, do you think it's more the false teaching from somebody speaking and the individuals buying into it, or the individuals not studying on their own as to why corruption, this leaven, even enters our brotherhood?
All of that. Yeah. Lack of study. Keeping up with things that are going on in the brotherhood. I just, several months ago, just became aware of the heaven and earth, the renovated earth doctrine that's going through the brotherhood. I hadn't heard about it, but it's something that started in Texas and has now made its way to Africa. Brethren in Africa are having to deal with it. But men that I've known for years have got caught up in it. That at the end, God's going to renovate the earth. It's going to be, instead of, like He kind of renovated the earth with the flood, He's going to do it with fire this time. And then God's going to leave heaven and come to earth and reign from here.
Is there any, besides Word of Mouth, talking to other individuals, is there any other source or person who can read about the brotherhood teachings that's going on in the brotherhood that's not?
Yeah, there's some papers that monthly publications that you can get that Contending for the Faith is one. And then The Watchman, Brother Brewer puts out The Watchman. And both of those are emailed. You have to get on their mailing list, and they email them to you each month. Those are about the only two that there are nowadays. I'm not sure about the Plumb Line, if they still do much of that. At one time they did, but oh yeah, they're all online, yeah.
Contending for the Faith, and the other one, Watchman?
The Watchman, yeah. And then the Plumb Line. What's the one that we get out there that's a month? Seek the old path, yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay.
I'll let you get back after class. I'll let you know.
Yeah.
Well, I knew that Jerry Jones, when, he was from Hardy, when he got hung up in the Boston Beat and so on like that. And he wrote about 3 books on but the name of the book was called What Does the Boston Movement Teach?
Hmm.
And he was very careful to do it that way because he didn't want to just start blasting as opposed to confronting someone face to face. He used their documents as opposed to his opinions.
Well,
What do
yeah.
they teach? Let me use their documents in this book and the things that he has collected.
Mm-hmm.
They have put in writing.
Yeah.
Showing that.
Well, I mean, that's the right way to go about doing it. You know, you don't want to use your opinions.
And I, at one point, owned all 3 of his books on that because at that time,
Hmm.
the Boston movement was
Yeah.
a big thing.
So,
Or whatever you choose to call
so
it.
there's,
Change names so many times.
huh?
I said, whatever you choose to call it, they change names so many times, the multiplying ministry,
Oh, yeah.
crossroads
Now,
ministry,
now it's the International Church of Christ. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't know that, I can't think of the guy's name that was,
Chip McKean.
yeah, McKean. I don't know that he's so much involved in it anymore. Yeah. But it's still out there. Mostly, it's in the Caribbean, and over in Europe, more than it is in the United States anymore. But when I was going to Jamaica, we were able to talk to the government officials in Jamaica and got them kicked off the island. But I don't know if they made it back by renaming themselves. But Brother Robinson has had to deal with them in Haiti. So, they have come to him a couple of times wanting him to work with them.
Well, the first thing they usually measure is your baptism wasn't valid because you should have been a disciple before you were baptized.
Yeah. Yeah, which is exactly what Matthew 28 says, right?
That's what they're using. Go forth, make disciples. See, there they are, the disciples.
Uh-huh.
So they're disciples first, and then they're baptized. But that doesn't answer for the people in Acts chapter 2, who there's no evidence that all of them were disciples when they preached that first gospel sermon.
Mm-hmm.